David Harper's shuttle touched down on Haven's Rest with the kind of gentle precision that suggested the planet was exactly what he'd been looking for. Quiet, peaceful, and far enough from Earth's corporate districts that emergency board meetings couldn't ruin his morning coffee. The frontier colony stretched out before him like a postcard advertising sustainable living, with small homesteads scattered across rolling hills, where human agricultural technology coexisted respectfully with indigenous plant communities. "Mr. Harper." The greeting came from Colony Administrator Walsh, a weathered woman whose handshake suggested she'd built most of the settlement's infrastructure personally. "Welcome to Haven's Rest. I trust the journey wasn't too terrible." Exactly as advertised. 3 weeks of peaceful hyperspace travel, followed by the most uneventful planetary approach of my life, David replied, shouldering his modest collection of personal belongings. "Which is exactly what I was hoping for." "Excellent. Your homestead is prepared, and I think you'll find the botanical research opportunities here are everything our recruitment materials promised." Walsh gestured toward a path that wound between crystalline formations and cultivated fields. "Though I should mention that frontier life does require some adjustment to local customs and neighbor relations." David's homestead turned out to be a modest prefabricated structure, with excellent views of both the agricultural valleys and the forested hills where indigenous life flourished undisturbed. More importantly, it came with a fully equipped botanical research station, where he could pursue his studies of sustainable agriculture without corporate oversight demanding immediate commercialization of every discovery. "This is perfect," David said, activating his research equipment and noting that the planet's unique soil chemistry would provide years of interesting study opportunities. "Though I have to ask, what did you mean about local customs? Are there cultural considerations I should be aware of?" "Nothing dramatic. Just remember that some of our residents come from different backgrounds, and frontier communities work best when everyone respects each other's privacy and traditions." Walsh pointed toward a larger homestead visible through the trees. "Your nearest neighbor is Elena Corvani. She's been here about 3 years, keeps to herself mostly, but she's extremely knowledgeable about local flora and has been helpful to other researchers." As Walsh departed and David began settling into his new home, he couldn't help but notice that his neighbor's property was considerably more established than his own. Well-maintained gardens surrounded a substantial house that seemed designed to harmonize with the natural landscape, while sophisticated botanical arrays suggested someone with both the resources and expertise to pursue serious agricultural research. The introduction came the next morning when David discovered Elena working in one of the garden areas that bordered their shared property line. She was tall, graceful, with silver hair that caught the early light and pointed ears that marked her as non-human, though of what species, David couldn't immediately determine. "You must be the new researcher," Elena said, looking up from what appeared to be a complex analysis of soil mineral content. "I'm Elena Corvani. Administrator Walsh mentioned you were interested in sustainable agriculture applications." "David Harper, and yes, that's exactly what brought me here." David approached the property line, noting that Elena's gardens showed a sophisticated understanding of both human agricultural techniques and indigenous plant relationships. "Though I have to say, your work here suggests considerably more expertise than Administrator Walsh's description of helpful to other researchers." Elena smiled, though something in her expression suggested she preferred to downplay her capabilities. "I've had time to learn the local conditions. 3 years of trial and error teaches you quite a lot about what works and what doesn't in this ecosystem. I don't suppose you'd be willing to share some of that knowledge. I'm particularly interested in nitrogen fixation relationships between terrestrial crops and indigenous root systems. I'd be happy to help, though I should warn you that my schedule is somewhat unconventional. I tend to do most of my field work during evening and early morning hours. David noted that Alina did seem remarkably pale for someone who spent time in agricultural research, but attributed it to personal preference or possibly medical sensitivity to the local sun's radiation. That's fine with me. I'm still adjusting to the local day cycle anyway. Over the following week, David found Alina to be exactly the kind of neighbor he'd hoped for when choosing frontier life. She provided invaluable advice about local growing conditions, respected his need for quiet research time, and possessed an impressive knowledge of indigenous plant species that greatly accelerated his acclimatization to Haven's Rest's unique ecosystem. The crystalline formations aren't just geological curiosities, Alina explained during one of their evening consultations, pointing to the mineral structures that dotted the landscape. They create microclimate conditions that certain plants have evolved to exploit. If you position your crops to take advantage of those effects, you can achieve yield improvements of 20 to 30%. That's remarkable. Have you published any papers on these relationships? I prefer to focus on practical applications rather than academic recognition, Alina replied, though something in her tone suggested there might be more complex reasons for avoiding scholarly attention. David didn't press the issue, respecting Alina's privacy while appreciating her willingness to share knowledge that was proving invaluable to his research. Frontier life was supposed to be about independence and mutual respect, not prying into neighbors' personal choices. The storm arrived during David's second week on Haven's Rest, with the kind of sudden intensity that made him grateful for Alina's warnings about local weather patterns. Hurricane-force winds and driving rain turned the peaceful agricultural settlement into a survival situation, and David's modest prefabricated shelter proved inadequate for conditions that apparently occurred several times per year. David, Alina's voice carried clearly through the storm, and he looked up to see her approaching his damaged shelter with emergency gear. Your roof won't hold through this. You need to come to my house until it passes. David looked at his research station, noting that several pieces of essential equipment were already showing water damage despite his efforts to protect them. I hate to impose, but you're probably right. This shelter wasn't designed for storms this severe. No imposition at all. Frontier communities survive by helping each other during emergencies. Alina helped him secure his most valuable research materials. My house is built to handle these conditions, and I have plenty of space for a temporary guest. As they made their way through the storm to Alina's substantial home, David reflected that accepting her hospitality was exactly the kind of neighborly cooperation that made frontier life appealing. Independent when possible, mutually supportive when necessary, with respect for each other's autonomy and traditions. He had no way of knowing that Alina's invitation had just placed her in violation of ancient laws that governed her species, or that his acceptance would activate covenant protocols that had been carefully avoided for 3 years of peaceful frontier living. Sometimes the most significant choices are made in complete ignorance of their implications, and David Harper had just unknowingly agreed to become part of something much older and more complex than frontier neighborliness. Alina's home proved to be significantly more sophisticated than David had expected from external observation. The interior was spacious and beautifully appointed, but designed with unusual attention to light control. Thick curtains blocked every window, while subtle artificial illumination created a warm ambience that felt more like perpetual evening than shelter from a midday storm. "Please make yourself comfortable," Alina said, though David noticed she seemed unusually nervous for someone offering routine hospitality. The storm should pass within a few hours, but frontier weather can be unpredictable. "This is incredibly generous of you," David replied, settling into what appeared to be a reading area lined with an impressive collection of botanical texts. "And I have to say, your collection suggests considerably more than casual interest in agricultural research." "I've had time to accumulate resources," Alina moved to what appeared to be a well-equipped kitchen, though David noticed the food preparation area seemed designed for cuisine that didn't require traditional cooking methods. "Can I offer you something to drink? I have traditional beverages from my homeworld." "That sounds fascinating. I'd love to try something authentically alien rather than the standard synthesized options." Alina paused in her preparations, and David caught something in her expression that seemed like internal conflict. "David, before I prepare anything, I should explain that my people have certain customs regarding hospitality that might seem unusual to human sensibilities. I'm interested in learning about different cultural traditions. That's part of what attracted me to frontier life. The opportunity to interact with species whose approaches to life might be completely different from human assumptions." "In that case," Alina said carefully, "I should mention that accepting food or drink in my home creates certain obligations according to the laws that govern my people. Not obligations for you," she added quickly, "but obligations for me that might complicate our neighborly relationship." David studied Alina's expression, noting genuine concern beneath her careful politeness. "What kind of obligations?" "The kind that require me to offer protection and certain forms of sustenance sharing that human biology isn't designed to handle safely." Alina moved to a cabinet that contained bottles filled with dark liquid that definitely wasn't wine. "My people are Velnathi. We require different forms of nutrition than most species." "Different how?" Alina turned to face him directly, and David noticed that her pale complexion and unusual strength suddenly made more sense when viewed in the context of species he'd encountered only in anthropological databases. "We require blood to survive," Alina said quietly. Not in the way that human mythology depicts vampires, but as a biological necessity that we've learned to manage through synthetic alternatives and careful social protocols that prevent harm to other species." David felt pieces clicking together in his mind. The nocturnal schedule, the sophisticated home setup that avoided natural lighting, the carefully maintained distance from other colonists. "You're telling me that my neighbor is a vampire." "Velnathi," Alina corrected. "Though the human term captures certain essential aspects of our biology, yes, and according to our ancient laws, offering hospitality to a guest means offering sustenance. That must be shared between host and visitor. Sustenance meaning blood, specifically my blood offered to you, and yours offered to me, creating what my people call the Sanguine Pact." Alina's voice carried the weight of cultural tradition mixed with personal dread. "It's designed to ensure that anyone who accepts shelter in a Velnathi home becomes bound to the family's protection network." David stared at Alina, processing information that made botanical research seem like a wonderfully simple pursuit. "And if I accept this Sanguine Pact, what exactly would that involve?" "You would gain access to my family's territorial networks and underground transportation systems, while I would become permanently responsible for your welfare and protection." Alina retrieved one of the bottles from her cabinet, and David could see that the dark liquid inside had a distinctly organic appearance. "But David, you should know that the pact also grants you legal authority over certain aspects of Velnathi governance, and that authority will make you a target for factions that have been hunting my people for generations." "Hunting you? For our blood, our transportation networks, and our longevity genetics. Human corporations have been systematically tracking Velnathi survivors to exploit our biological capabilities for commercial purposes." Alina poured the dark liquid into an ornate glass, and David realized he was looking at actual blood that had been prepared according to ceremonial requirements. "I moved to Haven's Rest specifically to avoid those complications, but refusing hospitality would violate everything my people believe about proper behavior toward guests." David looked at the glass Alina was offering him, understanding that his choice would determine not just their personal relationship, but her ability to maintain the careful balance she'd established between cultural obligations and survival necessities. "Alina," he said quietly, "what happens if I don't accept the pact?" "Then you remain safely human. I continue my careful isolation, and we maintain pleasant but distant neighborly relations that don't trigger ancient laws or attract corporate attention. And if I do accept it, then we become bound by covenants that will probably destroy the peaceful frontier life you came here to find, while possibly creating the kind of permanent partnership that my people haven't experienced in centuries." David studied Alina's face, seeing vulnerability mixed with hope and terror in her expression. Outside, the storm continued to rage, providing a suitable backdrop for making decisions that would reshape his understanding of community, responsibility, and the unexpected ways that accepting hospitality could transform someone's entire existence. "Alina," he said finally, reaching for the glass, "I came to Haven's Rest looking for something different from corporate life on Earth. I think this qualifies as different." Alina's relief was immediate and profound, though David caught something in her expression that suggested she was also terrified by the implications of what they were about to do. "Thank you," she whispered, "though I should warn you that Velnathi blood bonds are permanent, and that accepting this will change you in ways that human biology isn't designed to accommodate." "Change me how?" "Enhanced longevity, increased physical capabilities, and certain dietary requirements that will make it impossible to return to purely human existence." Alina raised her own glass, filled with what David assumed was his blood, though he couldn't remember when she might have obtained it. "The Sanguine Pact doesn't just create legal obligations, it creates biological ones." David looked at the glass in his hand, understanding that he was about to cross a threshold that would make his quiet botanical research career seem like preparation for something much more complex and permanent. "Well," he said, raising the glass in a toast, "here's to neighborhood cooperation and the unexpected consequences of accepting alien hospitality." As they drank, David felt something fundamental shift in his consciousness, not unpleasant, but like gaining access to awareness he hadn't known existed. Outside, the storm began to subside, but David had the distinct feeling that the most dramatic weather changes were just beginning in his personal life. Alina was watching him with an expression that mixed satisfaction with apprehension, and David realized that his peaceful retirement plans had just been permanently replaced by whatever responsibilities came with being blood bonded to a vampire neighbor who commanded ancient transportation networks and had been hiding from corporate exploitation for decades. He was beginning to suspect that this would either be the most interesting development of his life or the most spectacular failure of judgment in his personal history. Possibly both. The peaceful frontier morning that followed David's blood bonding was shattered by the arrival of 3 separate shuttle groups, each announcing their presence with the kind of bureaucratic authority that made corporate board meetings seem like casual social gatherings. David watched from Alina's kitchen window as representatives from Earth Corporate Council, Velnathi Traditional Authority, and several unidentified parties set up what appeared to be competing command posts around the settlement. "I take it this level of sudden attention isn't typical for Haven's Rest," David said, noting that Alina seemed remarkably calm for someone whose carefully maintained isolation had just been comprehensively destroyed. "The Sanguine Pact activation broadcasts certain energy signatures that can be detected by anyone monitoring Velnathi biological networks," Alina replied, checking displays that showed the approaching forces with disturbing precision. "I knew this would happen. I hoped we'd have more time to prepare." "Prepare for what exactly?" "Corporate exploitation teams wanting to capture us for blood extraction and network access. Velnathi traditionalists demanding that I dissolve the bond rather than contaminate our bloodline. And probably several intelligence agencies trying to determine whether this represents a threat to interspecies security protocols. Through the window, David could see Administrator Walsh approaching Alina's house, with the expression of someone whose quiet agricultural colony had just become the center of interstellar political attention. Behind her walked a stern-faced man in corporate attire, whose presence suggested that Earth-based interests were taking the situation very seriously. Alina Corvani, the corporate representative, announced without preamble, "I am Director Harrison from Earth Colonial Resource Management. We need to discuss your unauthorized sharing of alien biotechnology with a human citizen." "Director Harrison," Alina replied through the door's communication system, "I am not currently receiving visitors. Please coordinate any official inquiries through proper diplomatic channels." "Ms. Corvani, you have violated 17 regulations regarding interspecies technology transfer and created a security situation that requires immediate resolution. Open this door, or we will open it for you." David felt something shift in his awareness. Enhanced hearing, sharper vision, and an instinctive understanding of defensive capabilities that he definitely hadn't possessed 24 hours ago. "Alina, I'm getting the feeling that whatever the blood bond did to me includes some significant physical modifications. Velnathi biology enhances human capabilities in several ways," Alina confirmed, activating what appeared to be sophisticated security systems built into her home structure. "Increased strength, speed, and sensory acuity, plus access to energy networks that most species can't perceive." Energy networks. The transportation corridors my family maintains aren't just physical routes. They're quantum-encoded pathways that respond to Velnathi biometric signatures. Alina gestured toward a concealed entrance that was opening to reveal underground chambers David hadn't suspected existed. "Your blood bond grants you access to systems that span hundreds of light years." They descended into spaces that defied David's understanding of construction engineering, corridors that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of Alina's property, lined with crystalline formations that pulsed with their own internal light. The architecture felt ancient, purposeful, and designed to accommodate technologies that human science barely understood. "These are the evacuation routes," Alina explained as they moved through chambers filled with equipment that looked like transportation terminals. "My people built them during the Great Diaspora, when corporate hunting forced most Velnathi into hiding across frontier worlds." Corporate hunting. Velnathi blood extends human lifespan by decades and enhances physical capabilities beyond normal biological limits. Our transportation networks can move people and resources faster than conventional ships, bypassing established trade routes and regulatory controls. Alina activated displays that showed a vast network of connections spanning multiple star systems. Both capabilities are extremely valuable to organizations that profit from controlling access to longevity treatments and transportation monopolies. David studied the displays, recognizing economic patterns from his previous corporate experience. They're not just hunting individual Velnathi, they're trying to capture your entire infrastructure. Exactly. And the Sanguine Pact you've accepted grants you authority to activate evacuation protocols that could transport thousands of refugees to safety beyond corporate reach. A soft chime indicated activity in the upper levels of Alina's home, followed by the distinctive sound of forced entry. Alina's security displays showed multiple teams moving through her house with military precision, searching for access to the underground facilities. "They're not here to negotiate," David observed, noting the tactical gear and scanning equipment the intruders were carrying. "This is a capture operation." Director Harrison represents interests that have been systematically hunting Velnathi survivors for decades. They've learned that our blood bonds can be artificially maintained through technological means, allowing them to exploit our capabilities without our consent. And the Velnathi traditionalists. Elder Thankar's faction believes that blood bonds with non-Velnathi contaminate our racial purity and should be dissolved by any means necessary. Alina checked displays showing additional forces approaching the settlement. Both groups view you as either a valuable asset to be captured or a contamination to be eliminated. David felt his enhanced awareness expanding, providing tactical information about the forces above them and the defensive capabilities of the underground complex. Alina, I need to understand something. When you offered me the Sanguine Pact, did you know this would happen? I knew it was possible, Alina admitted. But I also knew that refusing hospitality would violate everything my people believe about proper treatment of guests, and that leaving you unprotected during the storm could have resulted in your death. So you chose to honor your cultural obligations, even though it would expose you to the hunting parties you've been avoiding for 3 years. I chose to do what was right according to my people's laws, regardless of the personal consequences. David looked around the underground chambers, seeing not just transportation terminals, but what appeared to be extensive living facilities designed to shelter large numbers of refugees. These evacuation routes, they're not just for Velnathi, are they? They're for anyone who needs safe passage away from persecution, exploitation, or corporate control. My people's laws require us to provide sanctuary to any being who requests protection. The security displays showed corporate teams beginning to locate access points to the underground complex, while Velnathi forces established perimeters that suggested they were preparing for siege operations. Alina, David said, decision crystallizing in his mind. What would happen if we formalized this blood bond through whatever full ceremony your people use? Would that give us enough authority to activate the evacuation networks for other threatened settlements? It would give us authority to activate the entire network, providing transportation and sanctuary for refugees throughout this sector of space. But David, the full Sanguine Covenant requires complete biological integration. You wouldn't just gain Velnathi capabilities. You'd become something new, permanently changed in ways that would make it impossible to return to human society. And if we don't formalize it, then the partial bond dissolves under pressure from the hunting parties. The evacuation networks remain sealed, and thousands of refugees across multiple worlds remain trapped by corporate exploitation and political persecution. David looked at the displays showing forces converging on their position, understanding that his choice would determine not just his personal future, but the survival of transportation networks that served as lifelines for displaced populations throughout the frontier. Alina, he said quietly, I came to Haven's Rest looking for a simple life focused on botanical research, but maybe what I actually needed was to find something worth becoming more than human to protect. Alina's expression mixed hope with terror as she realized he was agreeing to the full covenant. Are you certain? Because once we complete the ceremony, there's no returning to the life you planned. I'm certain, though I should probably mention that my experience with vampire transformation ceremonies is limited to human fiction, which I suspect isn't going to be particularly useful. The reality is considerably more complex, Alina said with a smile that showed Fang's David was just beginning to notice, but also more permanent. As they prepared for the most important ceremony of their lives, while corporate security teams and traditionalist purists closed in from above, David reflected that his search for peaceful frontier existence had led him to the most significant responsibility he'd ever imagined, ensuring that ancient promises of sanctuary remained available to anyone fleeing the storms of an unjust universe. He was beginning to suspect that this would either be the most important transformation of his career, or the most spectacular failure of species loyalty in human history. The formal Sanguine Covenant ceremony took place in the deepest chamber of the underground network, where ancient Velnathi technology created a ceremonial space that seemed to exist partially outside normal dimensional constraints. David knelt beside Alina before an altar that pulsed with organic light, while above them, corporate security teams and traditionalist forces prepared for what appeared to be a siege that would determine the fate of refugee transportation networks spanning multiple star systems. "Are you ready for this?" Alina asked, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the chamber's crystalline structures. "Because what we're about to do will permanently merge our biologies in ways that will make you as much Velnathi as human." "I'm about as ready as someone can be for voluntarily becoming a vampire to protect ancient evacuation routes, while corporate armies try to capture us for blood extraction," David replied, attempting to maintain some levity in a situation that felt like standing at the crossroads of species evolution. "Though I should probably mention that my knowledge of vampire transformation protocols comes entirely from old Earth movies, which I suspect aren't going to be particularly accurate. The reality involves considerably more biological complexity and considerably less dramatic cape wearing," Alina assured him, activating apparatus that looked like a combination of medical equipment and ancient religious artifacts. "Though the permanent lifestyle changes are quite accurate. No more botanical research in sunny fields. You'll be able to continue your research, but your optimal working hours will shift to nighttime, and your dietary requirements will expand to include regular blood consumption." Alina prepared ceremonial implements that appeared to be designed for precise biological modification. "On the positive side, your enhanced capabilities will allow you to perceive plant relationships that human senses can't detect." Elder Thanekar's voice echoed through the chamber's communication systems, broadcast from the forces surrounding Alina's property. "Lady Corvani, you have violated every tradition that governs our people's interactions with other species. Dissolve this contaminated bond and surrender yourself for purification." "Elder Thanekar," Alina replied through the chamber's ancient communication array, "I have honored our people's laws regarding hospitality and protection of guests. If you find those traditions inconvenient, perhaps you should examine your own commitment to Velnathi values. You would sacrifice racial purity for the convenience of one human." "I would honor our people's sacred obligations regardless of the political inconvenience they create for those who prefer isolation over responsibility." David felt the weight of decision settling around him as he understood that their choice wasn't just about personal transformation, but about whether ancient networks of sanctuary would continue to serve displaced populations or be captured by interests that viewed refugee assistance as profitable business opportunity. "Alina," he said quietly, "before we do this I need to know, what exactly will I become? Not just the capabilities but the responsibilities." "You'll become a network guardian, responsible for maintaining and protecting the evacuation routes that allow threatened populations to reach safety." Alina prepared the ceremonial chalice that would complete their biological integration. "Your enhanced lifespan will span centuries, during which you'll serve as bridge between species while ensuring that promises of sanctuary remain inviolate. Centuries of vampire diplomacy and refugee assistance. Centuries of serving something larger than individual survival or species loyalty." The chamber's defensive systems activated as corporate forces located the main access points and began attempting to breach the underground complex. Through their partial blood bond, David could sense the tactical situation developing above them. Military-grade equipment, biometric scanners designed to locate Velnathi energy signatures, and what appeared to be life support systems intended for long-term captivity of captured subjects. "They're not planning to negotiate," David observed, monitoring the security displays that showed corporate teams setting up extraction equipment. "This is a harvesting operation." Director Harrison's organization has been systematically capturing Velnathi survivors to establish permanent blood extraction facilities, Alina confirmed. "They've learned to maintain artificial blood bonds that provide access to our capabilities without requiring our consent or cooperation." And they want to do the same thing with the transportation networks, converting evacuation routes into commercial shipping lanes, charging premium rates for services that were designed to be freely available to anyone seeking refuge. David looked at the ceremonial implements Alina had prepared, understanding that accepting the full covenant would place him permanently beyond the reach of corporate exploitation, while making him responsible for protecting systems that served refugees across hundreds of worlds. "Alina," he said, taking the ceremonial chalice that contained her blood, "I accept the full sanguine covenant, knowing that this choice will make me something new and bind me to responsibilities that transcend individual species loyalty." Alina took her own chalice, filled with David's blood, and spoke the ancient words that would complete their transformation. "And I accept you as covenant partner, knowing that our bond will either preserve the sacred networks or destroy us both in the attempt." As they drank, David felt reality shift around him in ways that made his initial blood bond seem trivial by comparison. His consciousness expanded to encompass the entire transportation network, providing awareness of refugee movements across multiple star systems, while granting authority to activate evacuation routes that had been sealed for decades. But more than expanded awareness, he felt fundamental changes in his biology: enhanced strength that would allow him to protect the network facilities, improved sensory capabilities that would let him detect threats to refugee populations, and the kind of accelerated healing that would be essential for someone whose responsibilities might span centuries of conflict. The Covenant's completion triggered automatic activation of transportation networks throughout the frontier sector. Hidden terminals came online in settlements where populations had been trapped by corporate resource monopolies, while evacuation routes opened for refugees fleeing political persecution and environmental disasters. "Warning," announced the chamber's ancient AI, speaking in harmonics that predated human spaceflight. "Network activation detected by hostile monitoring systems. Corporate extraction teams attempting to breach primary defensive barriers." "Let them come," David said, feeling abilities he was still learning to control. "They came here expecting to capture two isolated Velnathi. Instead, they're facing network guardians with access to defensive systems they can't comprehend." The battle that followed was brief and decisive. Corporate security teams found themselves confronting not just enhanced vampiric capabilities, but automated defensive systems that had been designed to protect refugee networks against exactly this kind of exploitation attempt. Their equipment malfunctioned, their communications were jammed, and their extraction apparatus was systematically dismantled by technologies they couldn't understand, let alone counter. "This is impossible," Director Harrison's voice crackled through damaged communication equipment as his forces retreated in disorder. "No individual Velnathi has this level of defensive capability." "Director Harrison," David replied, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated through the network's communication systems, "you're not dealing with individual Velnathi anymore. You're dealing with network guardians who have authority over systems your corporate databases never suspected existed." Elder Thankar's traditionalist forces fared no better, discovering that their own people's defensive technologies now recognized David as a legitimate Velnathi authority, whose protection of the Covenant superseded their political objections to interspecies bonding. "This contamination will not stand," Elder Thankar declared as his forces were systematically disabled by the very networks they'd intended to purify. "The racial integrity of our people is preserved through honoring our sacred obligations to provide sanctuary for those who need protection," Alina replied, her voice now synchronized with David's through their completed bond. "If you find our people's highest traditions inconvenient, perhaps you should examine whether your politics have corrupted your understanding of Velnathi values." 6 months later, Network Guardian David Harper Corvani stood in the transportation control center that had once been Alina's basement, reviewing evacuation statistics that showed the scope of what their covenant had accomplished. The hyphenated name had been Alina's suggestion, representing the new form of existence they'd created together, neither fully human nor traditionally Velnathi, but something designed specifically to serve the networks that connected threatened populations to safety. The blood bond had evolved beyond its original survival requirements into a partnership that allowed them to coordinate refugee assistance across vast distances, while maintaining the kind of enhanced capabilities necessary for protecting ancient systems against modern exploitation attempts. David's botanical research had expanded to include food production optimization for refugee settlements, while his vampiric abilities allowed him to work tirelessly maintaining systems that ordinary human physiology couldn't sustain. "Any regrets?" Alina asked, joining him at the control displays where transport routes showed constant movement of beings fleeing various forms of persecution and seeking new homes beyond the reach of corporate control. "Well," David said thoughtfully, "I do miss being able to enjoy morning sunlight while working in agricultural fields. There's something appealingly straightforward about research that doesn't require fangs and century-long lifespans. As opposed to serving as an immortal vampire guardian of interstellar refugee networks, while maintaining blood bond partnerships that transcend species barriers, and coordinating evacuation operations that could determine whether entire populations survive corporate exploitation or environmental disasters. The work is considerably more complex than simple botanical research," Alina agreed, "though I think you've adapted well to the nocturnal lifestyle and enhanced dietary requirements." "The enhanced dietary requirements took some adjustment," David admitted, referring to his new need for regular blood consumption, which Alina's synthetic alternatives had made considerably more manageable than traditional vampire mythology suggested. "Though I have to say, the sensory enhancements have revealed plant relationships I never could have detected with purely human perception. And the centuries-long lifespan hasn't been a problem yet, though I suppose we'll find out how I feel about immortality after the first 100 years or so." Alina moved closer, and David marveled at how natural it felt to share consciousness with someone whose biology had become inseparable from his own. "There's something I should tell you about the network guardian responsibilities. More complications, more opportunities. The transportation networks don't just serve this sector, they connect to evacuation routes maintained by other guardian pairs throughout the galaxy. We're part of a much larger system of beings who have chosen to dedicate their extended lifespans to protecting refugees and maintaining sanctuary networks." David considered this revelation. "So not only did we accidentally become immortal vampire partners responsible for interstellar refugee assistance, we're also part of an ancient network of similar partnerships spanning multiple galaxies." "Essentially, yes. No pressure." "Right, no pressure at all." David grinned, feeling the familiar mix of terror and excitement that had become his normal response to learning about the cosmic scope of his responsibilities. "Well, if we're going to be part of an intergalactic network of vampire guardians, we'd better make sure we're good at it." "Agreed. Though I should probably warn you that network guardian partnerships often involve ceremonies and responsibilities we haven't encountered yet, including some that require coordinating with guardian pairs, whose species and capabilities we haven't even met. More ceremonial challenges that might involve transforming into something even further, beyond human experience." "Almost certainly. Perfect. I was getting bored with simple immortal vampire refugee coordination anyway." As their control center coordinated another successful evacuation, this time carrying families fleeing corporate strip mining operations to agricultural worlds where they could rebuild their lives, David reflected on the strange turns his frontier retirement had taken. He'd come to Haven's Rest seeking quiet botanical research and peaceful neighbor relations. Instead, he'd found something that made both human and Velnathi existence seem like preparation for responsibilities that transcended individual species survival. The Sanguine Covenant had taught him that the most important transformations weren't about becoming more powerful, but about becoming more useful to beings who needed protection from forces too large for individuals to face alone. Sometimes the greatest service required accepting invitations to become something greater than what you were, even when that acceptance came with fangs, immortal responsibilities, and the knowledge that your peaceful retirement plans had been permanently replaced by sacred obligations to keep ancient promises of sanctuary. The blood bond with Alina had shown him that love could literally transcend biological limitations, creating new forms of existence that served purposes larger than individual happiness or species loyalty. It was probably the most complex botanical research